okay, so I'm going to be talking about ranking and other properties of elite swimmers using extreme value theory. With my supervisors John from Manchester, Tim, Dave and Grace from Sports. So FINA is just kind of a governing body for swimming. They have these FINA rankings and they're used to rank swimmers across different events, all the 34 Olympic individual events. And they have this points-based system where a swimmer I in event J gets points PIJ, and it's proportional to some power of the ratio of their time, so TI in event J, to the base time B sub J. So apart from this being completely arbitrary, there's some other obvious flaws, which is that it's very sensitive to change in the world record. So you can imagine this base time B, which is usually taken as the world record, changes by someone gets a new world record, and suddenly you find yourself dropping really far down the ranks because you're further away from this world record. And sort of by a similar token, there's inherent bias between the events anyway, because certain world records are considered better than others. So essentially the points are given in reference to a single data point. So what we're saying is that a good ranking system should be robust to these sort of changes in the data. And we'd also like to quantify the uncertainty of these ranks. But from a good framework, we might find some other features of interest. We might find what's the ultimate possible time that someone could swim for a given event. We might want to know what the swim time of the next world record will be, when it will be broken, and which event it will be broken. And in addition to this, we'd hopefully be able to adjust for some technological advances as well in the sport. So this is kind of what my data looks like. This is data for the men's 100-metre butterfly. And I've got the fastest 200 times over the period from 2001 to late 2018. So you can already see that these are like the very fastest times. I've only had 200 over a 20-year period. And I had this for all 34 events. And we'd like to model the rate of these observations. So obviously, standard classic histogram. And we'd also like to model distribution. So given a particular year, what sort of distribution of times we get. Obviously, in reality, we don't discretize by year, it's a continuous covariate, but this is just a representation. So, we want to model both the rate and the distribution of these extreme events. And they're extreme because they're the very best over the 20-year period. By definition, there's very few observations looking at the very best swimmers. The data of the swimmer population isn't available anyway. But even if it was available, it wouldn't be very useful. And this is just a dummy example of why. So if we have sort of our dummy data X, shown by the histogram here, both these models, you could argue approximate the data equally well. And actually when you do model fits, they do pretty much as good as one another. But actually when we try and predict these extreme values, the upper tail of this distribution, we get order of magnitude differences in the probability of these events. And so clearly the bulk of the data is not a good descriptor for the extreme events. So we need a separate framework for analysing these extreme events. And this is extreme value theory. So there's two main ways of looking at, in extreme value theory. One is the block maxima approach. So if we have our data over 20 years, we could discretize it, we could chunk it up by year and take the maximum in a given year. And if we do that, if we get enough data, what we actually find is that the maximum conversion distribution to the generalised extreme value distribution function, which is given here, and the maths is in that form now. But there's also another way of doing it, and we could equally pick a high threshold. So in this case, 4 seems to be a high enough threshold, and we can just analyse all the data above this threshold. And if we do that and get more data, we can raise the threshold, and we find that this converges in distribution to the generalised Pareto distribution function. And then there's so these are sort of the densities of these things. So we find that the most likely yearly actor might be something like 4 or 5, and obviously with the generalised Pareto we just decay as we look at more extreme values. And of course we can change these, we can look at how the distributions change with different parameters. But what we're actually doing here is we're looking at a point process framework, so it's a slight amalgamation of the two approaches. And we combine the annual maximum with the peak over threshold process. We connect the two distributions as such. This is all pretty standard so far. And what we do is we define a point process over our over our space, where the intensity function follows extreme value distribution function. Okay, so that's kind of the maths, but really what we're saying is that we've got this great framework which will help us model the rate and the distribution of this extreme data for all the swim events. And we say that this data that we saw before, we're going to say that it follows a point process. So let's come back to the data again for a minute. So we've got our classic point process, but we want to capture some of these sort of things that we see in the data. So the first thing is we get a general trend in the rates of occurrence, as you can see in the histogram. We also find that you can't really see it from these model fits, is that the observations above threshold have time-independent distribution, which actually is really kind of convenient. But yeah, given a particular year, it doesn't really change. And we also find the swimsuit effect. So you can see the red crosses here and the red dashed lines here. Well, these actually correspond to the introduction and subsequent banning of swimsuits. I don't know if you remember the full body swimsuits swimmers used to wear. And you can see the effect that this has on the rate of the number of observations above this high threshold. So we need to somehow incorporate this as well when we're looking at our ranking system. And we capture these features through two additional parameters. So we have our classic three, our psi, mu, and sigma for the extreme value distribution. We have the beta, which controls the trend. So we've simply incorporated this with a linear trend in time, because we're sort of representing the swimmers getting better over time, as we saw from the histogram. And we have this gamma parameter, which controls the swimsuit effect. So essentially we're saying if the time is swam within the swimsuit period, we're going to have this extra effect. And yeah, okay. So our model contains 5 parameters. Right, it's not too bad, but we've got 34 Olympic swimming events, so we've got 170 parameters to model these 34 events. So clearly we'd like to reduce these, see if we can share something across all the events to improve the robustness and the predictive power of the information, of the model. So the first thing we tried was to use distance as a covariate, and in fact in things like athletics, a log-log relationship with the parameter and the distance works really, really well. But as you can see, the swimming, it's not so well, it doesn't work so well, and this is because of the way that we have many strokes for a given distance. So I'll explain what you're seeing here. So for example, this upper red triangle would be the log of the trend parameter for the women's 1500 metre freestyle. And you can read off all the parameters likewise. But because of the discretization of the distance, so obviously there's 1500 to 800 metres and so on, collapsing these points onto a single covariate is not really going to work very well, because it's going to introduce some inherent bias. So for example, we know that the 50 metre breaststroke is going to always be slower than the 50 metre freestyle. And so collapsing these into the same line is not going to work. So instead what we do is we use the threshold times covariate. So if you remember when we had the generalised Pareto distribution, we select a high threshold. If you use this as the covariate, you can see everything's looking much more linear now, or at least smooth. And so yeah, so the first model looks a bit like this. We say that the shape parameter is constant across all the events, and all the other parameters have approximately a log-log relationship with the log threshold swim time. And that we thought that would work pretty well, and it looked like it would be from the plots. It turned out that the assumption here for the scale parameter, which is the black points here, really didn't work very well at all. And this is because the confidence intervals around these points are very, very narrow. So we needed some non-parametric techniques. So we used some splines. So we use B-spline basis, and what that is essentially lots of functions placed at knots across the x-axis, and by changing the weights of these basis functions, where you can essentially create any sort of curve you want. So here's an example here. And essentially this equation describes the full spline. Now, when we introduce the spline, the model fits much better. So we still have this linearity with all the other parameters, but we just now allow a little bit more flexibility in the scale parameter. And it introduces only sort of another couple of degrees of freedom, but actually describes the data much better. And so we get these model fits like this. So let's go back to the fits that we saw at the start. We said we wanted to model the rate and the distribution of these observations. So the fitted rate of occurrences actually works pretty well. So we're seeing that so these red crosses are the actual data. Only one of these observations falls outside of our model. You can also see how the model predicts the increase as well of the swimsuit because of the swimsuit effects. And we also see the general increase over time as well. And for the distribution, we see something like this. So where the orange line is the model, the dashed line. And on here we can see the world record, the threshold that was selected, and it seems to fit pretty well. And I'll come on to the ultimate possible swim time in a minute. We've got some more stuff in there. So the rankings then. So obviously the main aim of this was to sort of create a fair and sort of unbiased ranking system. And the way we define a ranking is we say what's the rate at which people will come along and swim a better time than what we've just witnessed. And so that's the probability that so it's obviously so the probability times the rate at which we're getting observations in general. And so from our data, this is the sort of ranking we get. So there's a couple of surprises here. The first surprise is probably Adam Peaty's quite far down the ranking, so he's currently 19. And this is due to the fact that the swim time was done quite recently, and so although it is the current world record, because of the advancements over time, we're saying that it's not as good as someone that, for example, swam a slightly worse time in, say, 2002, 2003, because of the adjustments in dietary knowledge and technical advancements and things like this. We get a nice balance between sort of men's and women's events, so they're fairly equal, and also between distances as well. So the ranking seems to be quite unbiased across all the different factors that we're seeing. But I said at the start that there'd be maybe some other things of interest that would come out of a good framework. And here we're looking at the expected time. So we can get the expected swim time of the next world record. And this is normalised with respect to the current world record. So I'm just going to flip back the slide actually. So we can see these top two times here, Katie Ledecky and Sarah Sjöström. If we actually look at what those times correspond to, they are so basically the two red ones here, and the corresponding black ones above them. So we see that essentially the ultimate possible time, which is given by those red points, is very close to the time that they swam. So we're saying that the better the swim time, essentially the smaller this gap between the current world record and the ultimate possible time that we think someone could swim. So yeah, and it's quite nice that we see it's kind of flat across the expected next world record swim times in general, but we see such a massive range in these ultimate possible times, which is kind of to be expected. But as well as this, we have the time of the next world record. And again, these two times with Katie Ledecky and Sarah Sjöström stand out by being, we're expecting it's going to be sort of like 10 to 12 years before these records get broken. Whereas in the others, because of the advancements in technology and things like this, we're expecting it's going to be much less. And then we have the probability of it being broken in a given stroke, a given event. So obviously the worst world records are more likely to be broken next. Have the world record broken next. yeah, so that's everything. Thanks very much.
So we've got round about an hour for this part of the proceedings. So we're going to try and do a bit of kind of audience participation. So kind of tee up your questions for this illustrious panel about sports. For those that haven't met me, I'm Scott Heald. I'm one of the organising committee for this year's conference. And I'm also the head of statistics in NHS Scotland, so absolutely nothing to do with sport. So I was slightly bemused when I got the email from Rob asking me to chair this session, so delighted to do it. But you can tell by my physique that I'm the least sporty person, I think, in the room. And kind of my sporting knowledge consists of, I support Partick Thistle in the Scottish Football League. So if you don't know who they are, they're currently bottom of the championship. I say I support, actually it's my wife that supports. She's the season ticket holder. I usually get sent shopping when she goes to the match. That's how bad it is. And I'm also a fan of the Scotland football team, who are usually bottom of everything as well. So Rob has given me some questions to start the panel off, and then the idea is we'll open up to the audience to kind of join in as we go. So I might group the questions by different sports just to kind of keep it all going. So the initial set of questions are Rob's perspective of things. So I'm Scottish. I have quite a different perspective to some of the questions, so we'll see where we go, particularly when we get to tennis. We'll come back to that later on. So I think what would be helpful to start off is if we could ask each of the panellists to introduce themselves, maybe just a bit about your background, kind of why you're on the panel, and I think it'd be good just to know what's your favourite sport, just so we can get a sense of that in the room.
Right, I'll start. My name is Luigi Colombo. I work at Smart Dots. It's a company involved in essentially betting and gambling. We have been doing this now for about 14-15 years, and I've been involved from the beginning, in particular with building probabilistic models for assessing the strength of participants, so something quite similar to ranking system that we've just seen, and but with the ultimate goal of predicting odds, essentially. So that's very much my angle, and this is what I've been doing for quite a few years. Admittedly, for the past couple of years, I've been doing a little bit less of the quant stats work and a little bit more of the managerial side of it. But I still like to spend a little bit of time on our studio, and when Rob asked me to take part, I thought it would be a good idea to actually not use any of the models that we have at work, and to replicate some of the available solutions in the public and open source community. And so the reason why I've got a laptop in front of me is because actually I don't remember a lot of the stats. I prefer to have some numbers in front of me, and so thanks Rob for giving me an opportunity to have a little bit of fun with numbers and sports. I haven't done for a few months now.
And favourite sport?
Favourite sports, I would say football is the main one. Now I do like a bit of tennis as well, and a little bit of basketball. But admittedly, much more of a faith player than a connoisseur of the game.
Okay. So we have got some tennis and we have got some football questions. So okay, see where we go. Rob.
Cool. Rob Domenico, Vice Chair of Sports Section. That's why I'm on the panel, because I couldn't find a third person. I also work in a similar background to Luigi, run a consultancy company, kind of probably now a bit more involved on actual working with companies who do betting and that kind of side of things, so slightly different slant on it. But again, I have a background in modelling various different sports. My favourite sport is also football. Yes, I support Swindon Town.
I've never heard of Swindon Town, which I guess means they're not very good. And is that fair?
They're in the Premier League once.
For once.
When you were a young man.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, so I'm Harry Spearing, you just heard from me. I'm studying for a PhD at Lancaster University at the moment. So I'm doing ranking systems in sports. So obviously I'm looking at swimming at the moment, but I'm also looking at sort of other team sports as well. My favourite sport is cycling.
Okay, so you might want to think of some cycling questions because there are none in my prompt pack, so we'll see where we go to.
And we'll take any sport as well.
Yeah, so any sport at all you want to ask the panel about, you can do that. Can I just check if people at the back here, the speaker's okay? Okay, so we'll go with a general question to start with. So it's kind of tied into the presentation, and it was kind of touched on in the introductions there. So let's talk about rating systems. Are they good? Should we trust them? And what are the issues?
Okay, so
Yeah.
I guess, are they good? So I guess rating systems generally go down two different paths. So you have, depending on the purpose of the rating system, so if you're interested in prediction, you're going to get a completely different rating system than if you're interested in, for example, seeding in tennis. And the reason is because, if you're seeding in tennis, you want to make sure that they're fair and they can't be exploited. Whereas if you're looking at prediction, then you want to incorporate things like injury and those sorts of things as well. So yeah, I'd say it depends on the purpose. Just kind of a vague answer.
Do you think the current one's very good?
So for seeding, probably yes, they're probably okay. Prediction, absolutely not. And yeah, just for the reasons that I mentioned before. So for example, you can get an injury, and people fall massively down the rankings just because they haven't played for a few months. Does that mean that they're actually that bad? Probably not. But you can't let them retain that ranking, because then people could have spurious injuries if they're going through a period of bad form and things like that. So for prediction, they're very bad. What do you reckon?
Generally I agree. I think the key thing is that at least with my experience in looking at various rating systems, generally speaking, are not particularly, I would say actually, sorry, they're very informative when it comes down to predicting, because generally speaking, they're pretty good at giving a decent understanding of where are the strengths and who are the best participants, whether it's tennis or football. I think they're actually doing a very good job. However, when it comes down to predicting as the ultimate aim, once you compare it to other systems that have been designed with that in mind, definitely ranking systems, official ranking systems seems to lose some information in the process. But for me, that's one of the key things. We should make a clear distinction between the official ranking systems and the unofficial ones. Like anything that is official, meaning is used for whether it's seeding in tennis, whether it's some access to the Champions League in football, or the order in which you're going to start in your skiing competition. All of these systems are official, are used to give an impact on the way in which the game or the competition evolves on the day, and hence they have to be fair, as Harry was saying, and also I believe that they are meant to have some other desirable properties. One of them being easy to calculate. Very often this is a requirement that ranking system have. Being able to do to update a system as a back of the envelope calculations is a very desirable property for an official ranking system. And actually, I would say that's an interesting point. Is that was probably very true a few decades ago, but now with the access that we have to computational power on phone and data available immediately as an event finishes, it is very feasible to have official ranking systems that are much more sophisticated in that sense, and more complicated to calculate, and we can rely on that. And there are some good examples. I believe that in table tennis, the US Federation uses a fairly sophisticated system for ranking players, given also a measure of variability of uncertainty on the ranking. So you can imagine that it's the update is a sort of Bayesian update on the previous beliefs, which I think is quite cool. I think the Glico system by Professor Glickman, used for chess, is particularly good system. And the other one that comes to mind is the true skill or multi-skill patented by Microsoft, which is currently used for ranking players in video games. I mean, now officially it's not a sport as in the Olympics, but
it's going to be a sport in the Olympics, isn't it?
Getting too old. But the idea there is actually quite clever. They've got a system to rank thousands of players using a full version update live, and they use that to make sure that when you're matched online with another player, it is of either similar abilities or you have an idea of who you're going to play against. And that system is quite cool, patented, and is out there for all of us to use in various other situations, and we tried with some level of success, I would say. So that's your official ranking system. For an official one, as Harry was saying, and maybe Rob can say something as well, is prediction might be the key things you're interested in, and then obviously they can be as good as you want to make them, right? Or you can.
Yeah, I mean, the whole concept.
I'm dying to know, what do you think will Scotland qualify for the Euros?
I said this to you, it might get in on that lucky loser thing. All the teams. But that whole, even football rankings, we had that instance where Wales were third in the world, and they essentially didn't necessarily cheat the system, but by not playing friendlies and having a few good results, became the third best side in the world. And they clearly weren't the third best side. they were decent, but they didn't do anything wrong. That was just kind of, I don't even know if they planned not to play friendlies, but that really had a huge effect on where their rankings went up and they beat some good sides. And similarly, like sports like tennis, where we look at, the top players are really good, but when you go down the list a bit more, like what is the difference between the 8th and 9th player? And they treat it as if moving up one ranking in the ranking is a huge deal, but when you start looking at the data and actually how good these players are, and probably, like you said, the variability, they don't mean as much, but they need to be there because we probably need some way to rank players, but living and dying by those ranks aren't necessarily really important.
So that's how you look like you had a sharp and take a
Yeah, no, I
mentioned
just think,
Wales.
yeah, that's obviously why you want like confidence intervals in the ranks as well. And like, yeah, that's quite a big deal, that's what I think. Like, you could have someone that's 10th and 12th, but actually, if you look at the confidence intervals around there, they're exactly the same. And so trying to interpret meaningful differences in ranks when actually there is none can be a bit dangerous.
So let's stick with the rankings. There's a typo in Rob's next question. So it says, with his 26th victory against Federer and his 16th Grand Slam, can Djokovic be considered the greatest player of all time in tennis? I think what he meant to say is Andy Murray the greatest player of all time in tennis? And in spite of all of that, why is Federer often considered to be the best player?
Shall I say something about that? Generally speaking, I do believe Federer is the best player. So, and I'm saying these are purely subjective.
What about Andy Murray?
Yeah, anyway, it's a very, very good player.
I'm sorry, I'm not buying a drink tonight.
So, subjectively speaking, yeah, that's I believe he is the best player that in recent times, because again, I wouldn't be able to compare it to previous great players. It is one of the things that when Djokovic won the Wimbledon this year, it really looked like his level of supremacy towards the other big players of the moment, and took a big sharp uptick there. And so I went back and I started looking at some of the data, and I said, okay, well, if we stick to the last I don't know 20 years or so, who are the best players that we know? And Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, and why not Murray? He might very well be in that list. Obviously, I think the past 20 years we also had Sampras and Agassi that probably shouldn't necessarily exclude. So then I went back to the basics, and I said, well, as a statistician, how would I go about solving that? And probably many of you already gave it a go at some point in your free time or maybe for work. And so I went on Wikipedia, and here are some of the stats that I'm reading off from my notes. So Djokovic won 16 Grand Slams, Nadal 18 and Federer 20. So that way you would say Federer is easily a leading. Yeah? Even more impressively, and I didn't realize this until I checked it, like Federer has been ranked number one in the world, we obviously a flawed system, for a total of 310 weeks, and the longest spell was 237 weeks. So he's been essentially almost for 5 years the best, one of the best players. To give some comparison, Djokovic longest spell was 43 weeks, and Nadal 56. So quite a big difference. However, I would expect Djokovic in particular to have quite a few more years in his career. Then I looked at head-to-head. So this is the reason why I look at head-to-heads is because typically when at work, when we speak with, let's say, prices or traders or people making decisions on whether to place a bet or not, they tend to believe that head-to-head in tennis and in general any sport would be quite relevant. Generally, we don't find a lot of evidence for that, but I still thought, okay, let's have a look. And Djokovic actually beat Nadal 28 times and lost against him 26 times. And then Djokovic beat Roger Federer 26 times and he lost only 22 times. If you look in terms of head-to-head, Djokovic actually is the player who has won against the other two more than anyone else. Anyway, that was definitely not enough. So I went to fit a Bradley Terry model. You probably have seen this in the context of sports or any other comparison situation. And I ended up looking at taking the 230 players who in the past 20 years played at least more than 100 games, more than 100 matches continuously during this period. And so I ended up with these 230 players and a fit static model, so no dynamic, no time varying coefficient. And I thought, okay, if we look at all of these results, who would be the best player? And unfortunately, Nadal came on top. Now I've got 3 systems. I got 3 different answers. And you can see where I'm going with this. Then I started improving the model and I said, okay, let's add some time dynamics and start looking at rolling windows. When I started looking at rolling windows, I had to take a clear reference point and say, okay, who's the player who during these 20 years has always been there, and I can use it as a reference. And funnily enough, Tommy Haas, if you follow tennis, he's been there forever, and so it was a good reference. So then I ended up doing rolling windows of this model, and Djokovic ended up being the best player of all time. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it depends what you're trying to measure or how we define the best player of all time. So we end up with very completely different results. I had a look at Andy Murray.
I was going to say, if we were Scottish, we'd be adjusting all those to the Scotland effect. And
shame I can't show it. I've got Andy Murray in here, and he seems to follow more or less the trend of players getting better in time. But in my very short sample, he never made it to the top of these players. But the closest he got, I think he was maybe third. It was definitely you can definitely consider him better than Nadal during the time where he was at his best. So that's that was my contribution to Scottish tennis.
Yeah, we'll take that. So I'm going to move on to another question just to get I want to get Rob fired up because the notes tell me that he has very strong opinions about this particular question. So we're going to go to football. Is the money out of control? And with higher transfer fees and teams going bust, where is football at?
Yeah, I do have moderately strong opinions on this. I actually think if you look at the data and the evidence, well, the data is for the last few years, less people are watching football. It's got there's kind of an element of there potentially is a bubble whereas like, everything's driven by like Premier League money coming in, and historically it's going up, so there's more money in the Premier League than ever. But it's kind of hidden in terms of Premier League always does 3-year windows of selling their rights, and previously they've sold them. The biggest market's England, so BT Sport. Are we recording this as well? Yeah. Okay, we'll wipe this later. BT Sport and Sky essentially paid the most money, and what's been happening over time is they've started going and finding other markets, so the African markets, the Asian markets, American markets. This pushed revenues up more and more, but what hasn't necessarily happened is the viewing rates haven't kind of gone up at the same level, especially in the biggest market, which is England. And there was kind of warnings before from the big companies that actually we may be overspent on this, and the kind of saturation of football on telly, especially at the Premier League level, is quite high. So we've now got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday games alongside the Tuesday, Wednesday Champions League and the Thursday Europa Leagues. And the appetite's not there in terms of viewing figures. So there's this kind of conundrum. Are clubs overspending on what they've got relative to what might come in the future? I'm kind of curious of whether the money will keep coming and going up at that rate. If you look at things historically when everything's gone to shit, it's generally where people always think something's going to go up. So housing market would always go up forever. So people continually think that's going to happen. And this kind of trickle-down effect of transfer fees going up, and then essentially other clubs thinking they can spend more because there'll always be the money. I'm kind of curious of whether that will continue, or whether we'll get to a point where the money won't come in, or the money will stay static, and people are kind of hedging their bets on continue going up. And the big clubs will survive this because the revenues they make will kind of cover them. But we're already seeing it trickle down. If you look at an example like Bury, like that is just a horrendous story of a club with no kind of money management, who are kind of going, essentially spending everything to try and make their way out. You know, they sell the stadium, mortgage that off, overspend on players to get promoted, and not going into the kind of ethics of how clubs should be run. Clubs do kind of push for that kind of golden goose of the Premier League. But I wonder whether there's an argument that potentially, will that always be the same? We've seen it in leagues like Italy, historically in the 90s, was the big league. Everyone went to Italy. You might not be old enough to remember this, probably not. But in the 90s, that horrendously big transfer fees, like they spent lots of money on players, but that dropped off, the money kind of fell out. Obviously England is now the boom and kind of driving everything. I wonder whether people are actually thinking ahead and looking at the actual what's in the data and whether this can continue, because there are potential issues if some of the big players come out. Kind of on the converse though, you've got these things like Netflix and Amazon Prime that potentially may come in and save the day. So it might be I might be completely off the point where we are, but I wonder whether there's an issue in terms of the money coming in and clubs chasing glory.
So I'm totally intrigued on how did Netflix save the day?
Well, Amazon Prime have bought the rights to the football at Christmas, so if you want to watch football over Christmas, you have to have Amazon Prime. So the package between December and where you get your Boxing Day fixtures, it's all on Amazon Prime this year, and there was a thought that someone would come in and buy this package, because obviously these big companies with huge revenues are trying to get more content. But then at the same time, Netflix viewers aren't necessarily, their share price is dropping because everybody's pushing to get more and more content out, and so is there a space for Premier League football and football in general and the volume they need to sell to charge the money that they want? I don't think it'll be the end of the road for football, but I wonder, when we're spending £200 million on a player, or £100 million is now the norm, is that sustainable for all clubs? And if it does drop off, what the effect will be, because will clubs be massively in debt? Will they just write it off? You've seen it with like an Arsenal who they've got a small budget and spend 70 million on a player, but they can only pay that off in instalments. Certain clubs are doing it, but others are really kind of pushing the boat out to, maintain where they are, because the money's there. It's money fueling money.
Okay, that didn't sound like too much of a rant, but we'll...
Yeah, it's pretty good.
Any of the other panellists want to comment on that?
It's definitely a rant, yes.
Yeah.
From my point of view, is partly related to this was I've noticed the complexity of the deals behind buying players has increased incredibly in the past few years, and they are referring maybe to the Italian market more so than the English one. Now it's quite common for football teams to loan players with a mandatory clause to rebuy them in a year time, and that allows them to do all sorts of a positive financial accountancy jump, so that make them look like it's okay, but really they are simply deferring the liabilities to the following year. And then when the 30th of June the following year comes, so what they do is they're forced to sell those players and continue this wheel of continuing loaning and postponing liabilities to the future. And at some point, this might not be possible, and clubs will suffer. And in Italy, we've seen quite a few football clubs going bust much more often than it happens here in the UK. But it's part of it. Maybe it's this incredible amount of money going around.
I just reminded when I first met my wife, this is a bit of a story going back. I just met her and she was a Partick Thistle fan and they almost went bust. They had a campaign, Save the Jags, so every week I had to keep buying all these random items to try and save Partick, and they did. But now they're at the bottom of the championship because they've got no money and they won't live out with their means.
So you're going to have to buy more stuff?
Yeah, so company toys and cups and everything, you name it. Okay, I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to open it out to the audience. So just think of your questions. So you can ask anything at all to the panel, or you can comment on what you've heard them say, disagree, agree, whatever. So the final question before we open out, let's go to the Rugby World Cup. So who should we be aware of, and will a home nation win? You can guess code, will Scotland win? Or will Wales win, probably?
I don't know if this is probably not my area, but I don't know. Yeah, I guess one of the questions was it what should we be wary of for the World Cup as well? But I was thinking about so friendlies and stuff, in the difference between friendlies and rugby and football. So in football, international friendlies, you tend to not have as well. You put out your strong team for the friendlies to get ready for the World Cup. In rugby, you tend not to get that at all. So a couple of the best players might only play one of the friendlies. So I guess that's something to watch out in terms of, well, if you're in the area, you're looking at prediction and stuff. You might have a completely different team for the actual matches you're interested in predicting, the matches that you're actually testing on. Yeah, that's just a thought. So, yeah, it's a question.
And will our home team win?
Potentially.
I was going to ask each of you that question. So
I've answered it now.
And we'll come back to haunt you because it's all on video.
I would say no.
The home team won't win.
No.
No, there's no pictures.
Who will win?
Yeah.
I don't know really. I don't know.
You can think about that. We'll come
Yeah,
back.
I would think.
Rob,
I say probably, possibly. It's a statistician's answer, isn't it?
there's an awful lot of these kind of probably, possibly, depending on the method, you get different answer type questions to this panel. So
It's good statistics.
yeah, it is. So we'll take that. Luigi,
I
do you care?
don't have an opinion on that.
Italians good.
Italians, yeah.
Italian will win.
The only good thing about the Italians being in the Six Nations is that Scotland always end up higher in the league than they do, so we're very grateful you're there.
It's very painful.
Yeah. So we've still got about half an hour, so I've got loads more questions, but I thought rather than just giving the panel planted questions, we thought we'd open it out to the audience. So maybe anybody got anything they want to ask? So we'll maybe take a couple of questions, then we'll fire it to the panel. So yeah.
Hi, I have a quite specific question, but you might be able to answer. Arguably, the number of dangerous attacks, we're talking about football, is a good predictor of what's going to happen in the game. I've always wondered how this statistic is produced and if it's possible at all to get some data on that.
Okay. There's another question.
Okay, my question's on assessing the performance of players, and I'm thinking of baseball, but the same issue comes up in many other sports where you're watching a game and you get this endless commentary. So Joe is up to bat, and you get his batting average. He's a left-handed batter against right-handed pitchers in the second innings of a game with a man on base, and when they're playing away, and when it's not raining. And you know, the subdivision of this data just goes on and on. You have no idea what the important covariates might be to tell you what the performance of this guy really is. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you. Any others? So we'll get one there.
Hello. How important is it to communicate these sophisticated ranking systems to the athletes who are trying to climb up the ranks? In other words, is it acceptable for these athletes to treat these ranking systems as a black box?
Okay, good question. There's one there, yeah.
Is that me?
Yeah.
So just somewhat linked to the baseball, somewhat linked to the money. I assume you're probably familiar with the book Moneyball and the movie. What do you think about that statsification of sport and so the interface between that and money and skill and actual enjoyment of a game?
Okay, so those other hands going up, I will come back to people, so we'll start with those four. So let's start with the dangerous attacks in football. Is that a predictor?
You want to know where it comes from, yeah?
How is it produced? Because for me, it looks like what's dangerous, more dangerous, less dangerous.
It's a bit more vague than it's a running ball statistic. So the company Running Ball, who are owned by Perform, essentially produce these, and it's a scout at a game with some kind of device. And when the ball gets into a certain area of the pitch, it is classified as a dangerous attack. Now that might seem actually really good, but it's dependent on the person watching it. And from experience, from using that type of data or seeing it, it can be quite variable. I've very regularly watched a game whilst having that there, and they don't always match up. Someone might forget to click the button, or they click the wrong button. There isn't, because it's a live feed as well, there isn't that kind of verification of what's going on. So it's not like you've got two people doing it and they'll kind of balance each other out. It's to give an image of the game. So whilst that it takes you a step beyond just looking at kind of basic shots in a game, or whatever that kind of stat is, it does break the game down. It kind of does correlate to broadly what you see. It can be a tad unreliable because again it's a manual process, and that data kind of isn't always necessarily what it should be.
I think part of, I agree. And the other side of your question was, can I get some data?
Yeah.
And well, the straight answer is no. However, if anyone has got an interesting idea for an MSc, a PhD, for anything, absolutely drop me an email. I'm more than happy to talk about it. But the one thing I wanted to say is actually it's a very interesting. I don't know how public this is. I'm pretty sure it is public. The reason was,
Anyway,
Yeah, remember it's on video, so
it's on video.
we're going
So that allows me to go for an official rant.
that's the way.
So the reason why the data is not available, it's actually quite interesting. I mean, who owns this data? Is it the football player? Is it the league? Is it Performer or other companies doing this? It's actually quite an interesting legal question, and one that has actually hit now the news this year, just a few weeks ago. The reason for that is another company, so there are several companies doing this. There's another company, Bet Genius, part of the Genius Group, quite big, fully backed by, I think, a big hedge fund. They bought the right for exactly the data that you were asking about, for all of the UAK football. So with English Prem being the biggest league, at least in the world of gambling, it is the biggest league.
in monetary terms, it's the biggest league.
By many measures, being the most important one. So this was a big blow for a lot of operators, bookmakers in particular. Us, not as much, unfortunately. So what happens is now we have two providers, and they're selling some data is official, some data is unofficial, and they overlap. And we as operators will end up having to buy both, and it's not particularly good. And then the question arises: is well, why do you own this data? What is the legal proceeding that brings you Bet Genius or Bet Radar or Perform to actually own this data? And of course they paid for it. Dataco is selling this data, but I think this will be a very interesting topic in the years to come, especially as the US opens up the gambling market if they do, and as the statistification of the sports increases, actually who owns this data and how we can get access to it, should that be public, should that be open? I think these are very good questions and topic that will be very important.
To follow on, I think leagues will start selling their own data rights to people, as opposed to somebody owning all the data. I think that's probably where it's going to go. Leagues, the big leagues will start figuring out that they actually, this is our product and we're going to license our own data, which I think Spain have talked about for a while. I don't know whatever happened to that, but just because there's so much money in that data, and companies like Opta and Running Ball and various others have that and sell it, and they make lots of money from it.
Are there any views on that?
Yeah, so you're talking about dangerous attacks. Yeah, so I guess it would be interesting to see if you could automate that, I suppose, instead of having someone click there, clicking there. I guess that would give you a lot more consistency from match to match. But yeah, you have to be really careful how you define it, because you know, obviously, like for example, having a ball in a specific area, well, for one team that can be something completely different to another team. You know, if you have teams that work down the wings and cross the ball in, you're not going to get as much of the ball around the penalty area. When you do, it probably can be very dangerous. So it's a difficult question, but it's probably something that automation could work quite well for, I'd say.
Thank you. So I'm keeping rank of the rants. So you're allowed one, Harry, at some point in the next 20 minutes, so we can go on. Okay, the next question then is about assessing the players, so particularly about baseball, where there's just tons and tons and tons of facts. How do you sort the beat for the champ? Who wants to take that?
Okay, yeah, so I think so machine learning techniques would be quite good for this sort of thing. So I guess you have loads and loads of covariates and you're trying to assess how each of them impact, and they're going to obviously, a lot of them are going to be highly correlated. You're going to have lots of interactions between them as well. So I guess it's perfect for something like a random forest, and you could try and draw out sort of the variable importance measures like that. And there seems to be enough data for baseball as well. So I guess that would be my first stab.
And how would you do that in real time when you're watching the game and they're firing all these facts at you? How would a layperson understand?
Oh, is it like?
I think was that more the question? So when you're watching, you
Yeah,
get bombarded with
it
facts,
may
and
be
you're like,
that
so what?
you know, a lot of the time in a baseball game, nothing much is happening, so the commentators have to have something to say, and that's what they come up with.
I find baseball a bit like cricket. It's like watching paint dry.
Well, careful.
Completely different.
I know it is. Okay, well, let's take so we have a question about the ranking of athletes and the black boxes behind it all, and should the athletes understand how it's all done? Who wants to take that one? I'm going to have
Yeah, I mean, I think I partly mentioned it while I was talking about banking systems, and yeah, I mean, whether it's acceptable or not, I think it's more of a cultural problem than anything else. In some sports, it's really good to have a system that is simple, and other sports are much happier to accept a black box. Now, players, maybe it's different. I mean, I think it was a good example about Wales, but that actually happens day in and day out in tennis, so where players choose exactly what to play and where to go, or based on obviously where they can get in, based on penalties that they have to pay if they don't show up. But they have introduced quite hefty penalties if you say you're going to play and then you don't turn up. But you'll see a few occasional players turning up, play one set and leave, just because that's the way to avoid that penalty. But going back to the ranking system, they also going to play the games that allows them not to lose too many points based on what tournament they played the previous year. So yes, they do want to have an understanding, but I guess that they are part of the system. If you give them an understanding, they will use it. If you give them something as a black box, they won't be able to use it. I don't know whether that's good or bad for the game, but players will adapt very, very quickly. They are financially motivated to make the most out of it.
Do you have that in swimming? Because obviously, or any of the other stuff you've kind of looked at?
Yeah, so I did have a look at tennis ranking systems at one point. Yeah, and that's very interesting. But yeah, I guess it depends if the sport you're looking at, if you have a choice of fixtures or not. Because if you've got a choice of fixtures, then yeah, it kind of becomes important to know system works, because actually that's part of the game then, is selecting which competition to enter and which competition not to enter is part of the game. Whereas if you've got a sport where you just get given the fixtures and told to play them, then maybe black box would be better, because you're just essentially encouraging players or teams to win as much as they can, and that's more exciting than people trying to play the system.
Unless it might not just be based on winning though. That's the other thing. Was like, are there other covariates that you go into? Like, will you get, if you attack more or shoot more, do you get more, does your ranking get affected? And I don't know, with those types of things, when you go beyond just the result, I kind of like the thing in football where one approach doesn't supersede everything. Like, if you're Pep Guardiola, somebody can come in and just knock it long all day and they'll win sometimes. There's different approaches you can do. You can kind of achieve what you want in different ways.
Yeah, I guess it comes back to, as well, maybe prediction versus sort of seeding type thing, because then if you can knock it long and beat a team without actually winning, it's kind of, is that fair? I don't know. It's a moral question maybe.
Okay. So before we get into all the morality of sport, the Moneyball questions, that was about, there's a book, Statistical of Sport, was that what you were?
Yeah, I suppose, what do you think about how the stats and the money actually impacts on the value of sport for the viewer, really, or the fan? Is that bad? We're obviously maybe a bit biased, but is it a good thing? Is it a bad thing? What do you think the pros and cons have been?
Professionally doing like sports and statistics and modelling, it kind of ruins it a little bit. It kind of makes it more. You can't watch a game. A lot of kind of things you see in the media, the way people talk about teams and players. Once you understand concepts like variance and how rankings work, and what the chances actually were in a game, and it kind of not ruins it, but you've brainwashed yourself into thinking a different way. As opposed to if we take something like Moneyball, I mean that was. Actually, when you look back to what they did, it wasn't necessarily that complicated, but it was.
So just for the uninitiated, what's Moneyball?
Moneyball was a book by Michael Lewis which covered the Oakland days and how they brought in somebody from MIT with background in economics to essentially look at players who were underrated. So in baseball, they were a kind of middle of the road, low budget team who couldn't compete. The manager wanted to compete, and they would recruit players in exactly the same way. All about how you look, all about kind of how hard you hit the ball, was it the 4 things they look for in a player? I can't remember what they are. And this guy come in and he was like, actually we're looking at all the wrong players. We don't do it in single players, we can do it in the kind of combination. So they would look at kind of data relating to players and say, we've got budget X, if we pick up these players, they will get us the exact same result as say trying to get one player who we may not be able to get. And that kind of looking at the data to essentially quantify what each player was worth, it made them do quite well. They're not the best they could have done. They went on a really good run, and the film's really good. I won't ruin it for you. You should watch it. You should also read some more of his books because they're really good. But that's kind of bled its way now into other sports. So American football, basketball, soccer now. Clubs are trying to adopt similar approaches, and so the data kind of driven approach is. There is a mass community who are really into this. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. Some clubs do it very well, some probably not so. And there's examples of, say, Liverpool, who are actually backed by Fenway Group, who are a baseball group, trying to use a very similar Moneyball approach and supposedly using it. No one actually knows what they did. Bought a load of players that failed quite badly. But there are other clubs who are using these kind of data-driven approaches and are very successful. So I think it's a good thing in the game. I think it'll become adopted more and more. Certain clubs are very into it. There's a big community for it, but there's always going to be resistance. I've gone out and spoken to clubs about doing stuff with it, and a lot of the time they're quite resistant to it because they don't understand it. So you kind of need buy-in throughout. And I think in American sports, going back to your question from before, they're so data-driven. You pick up an American newspaper and you look at the sports section, and it is pages and pages of just data related to what's happened. And they love it. Fantasy sports over there, they're really into that. We don't quite have that. We have it to a degree, but I think that's why they're probably more open to it, and people work on that kind of thing. Football, I think, is going to benefit from it, but I think other sports will see it more. There's an example in the golf, I think it was the Ryder Cup. There's a as a company who were providing kind of analytical help to the Europeans, and supposedly were quite good at, gave them a bit of an edge in terms of what they could do. And I think there are other sports that will kind of go into, probably back to stuff that you're doing as well.
Yeah, I guess it helps the small teams do well, I think, which is quite a nice. It's quite a nice outcome. But I don't know if it ruins it, because it didn't necessarily affect the in terms of the spectators. I don't think it makes that much difference.
It just ruined it for me.
Yeah.
Was that the second round?
The problem is you've had, I'm just thinking, I'm sorry to keep going on about being Scottish, but we go to see Scotland football matches, so I'm going to see Scotland play Russia tomorrow. Every game we go to, we always have this deep-seated hope we're going to win. We never do, but that's always, no, so we don't care about what the stats are telling us, it's always like something's going to happen, that somehow they're going to win. So I'm conscious of time, so there was a couple more hands went up earlier, so let's take some more questions from the panel. So yeah, the guy in front.
So when you see, I think Match of the Day now have at the end of the game they will show the expected goals, or in other sports, so at the Cricket World Cup, it came up as like, in the sort of first innings it would be expected score, which never seemed to be accurate until you got down to like the very end where there was nothing they could really do. And so do you trust statistics like that when they are put on the screen and they're used as a way of sort of gauging performance?
Okay, thank you. There was a hand there, yeah.
So, I'm an Arsenal fan, know what you will. And I've had the pleasure of watching Skodran Mustafi play at centre-back for my club for the last 3 years. And I think his signing came off the back of Arsenal purchasing a club called the company called Stat DNA. And that seemed to lead to a few of these signings. So we had Mustafi and there was a couple of others. I'll focus on Mustafi. And all the stats say that he's a fantastic footballer. Like, you look at who scores ratings and stuff, and he'll consistently get 7.6 out of 10 or something like that. But he's, he'll come up with brain dead mistakes that lead to, the other team scoring goals. Is there a limit to how much these stats can tell us? So, on paper, he's a really good footballer, but you only have to watch him for 25 minutes to see that. Not.
Okay, there's another hand. Yeah.
Just on a slightly different note, my vague impression from having been to this a couple of years ago in Glasgow and coming again now is that we moved slightly from statistics in the service of sport to statistics in the service of gambling. I just wondered whether that was a fair assessment of what's happened in the sort of methodology world, and if that was a good thing, a bad thing, or neutral.
Okay, so that's a great controversial question to have near the end, so thank you. So let's take the non-controversial ones. So the first match of the day, expected goals.
How accurate are these models?
It's going to be a rant, isn't it?
No, it's not. How accurate they are? Well, they're good models, and we have our own versions of it. And at the end of the day, if you look at it, you basically got a binomial regression with a few covariates on the right hand side. You add a few splines, these GAM models that you can fit. And once you have the data, it's relatively simple to come up with it. Now, how good are they? Well, I actually think they're pretty decent at describing it. And then it depends how you use it. What's the use you make of it. So if you say, or at the end of the game, here are some XG stats. Well, I think there is some value in terms of delivering some content. Now, whether that matters or not, I don't know. It depends what you want to do with this data. If you want to gamble, you can measure the value that these add because you have a very clear experiment that you can run. But if you are a media a content provider, you want to engage the the audience, you're probably going to look at completely different measures, as in how many people did change the channel at that point, how many people actually thought that was interesting. And if they're doing this, presumably, and I have no insight into that, is because the people are finding getting some engaging with it. So, to me, that's not necessarily a measure of accuracy when it comes down to how reflective it is of the actual performance. And I suspect that if you take maybe an analyst in a football team, he will look at those stats very differently than what a punter on TV would do. Typically on TV you always get, oh look at this amazing XG that this player had, and of course you will always have some extreme value. You will always have one player who had the highest XG, and but actually when you look at the distribution, that's much more boring than it sounds.
Just if anyone don't know, XG is where you take all your shots from the position, and essentially if you shoot really close to goal, you have a higher probability of scoring, and you just add them up, multiply by the probability of scoring in certain bins, and then that's your value. Which, when you watch Match of the Day, what gets me when you watch Match of the Day is you watch the game and you've seen all the chances, so you kind of knew what happened, and then all you get is the XG at the end, which kind of says, well, that's exactly what I saw. So it's like, it's just telling me what I've seen. I think there's value if you haven't seen anything and you can, like, someone says, oh, so-and-so played so-and-so, it's this score, and someone says, what's the XG? Then that kind of gives you some information, in a game where somebody wins 1-0, but the other team had like 6 really good chances, the XG could be much favourable to the team that lost, and that's a nice summary. I don't know whether a Match of the Day kind of has it right in terms of how they use it. I think they just kind of, generally they bolt it on in the stats at the end, and whilst it's nice that they're doing it, it doesn't necessarily give you any insight into what that is, more so than having just watched the 4 or 5 minute highlight package that they gave you.
It's quite nice is in conjunction there, I guess.
Yeah, no, I don't have a problem with it.
Because it's quite, because I sometimes like to watch the highlights and then see where I sit in compared to the actual XG, and like that difference can sometimes quite interesting. Yeah, well, because back to your point about how good are they? I guess so. And you're saying in the cricket example, it gets to the end of the match and basically, well, obviously it's going to be pretty bang on. But I guess that's just the effect of having like narrowing confidence intervals as you go through time. So actually, if they put good confidence intervals on it, you might find that actually it does track it pretty well. But just because they're so wide at the start of the game, it looks like it's...
Because nobody would understand the interval. If
Yeah,
they gave you an interval
Yeah,
expected
exactly,
goal, the audience would be lost.
Exactly.
Yeah, the concept of variability is lost. If people could understand that, and I think it would make sport more interesting, because that's essentially why I like sport. It's the randomness. It's the fact that any team, any player on any given day can beat anyone else. But people kind of like to see definitive numbers and then kind of form opinions off that, which...
just to be David's advocate on confidence interval, if I say, oh look, this game has got a 95% chance, football match, to be between 0 and 4 goals, I'm not really giving a lot of information. Even though it's easy to understand, it's not telling you much. Whereas if I say the expected goal, say here is, 2.6, and the other game is 2.7, you've got the perception that that game might be a bit more open. The reality there, the same confidence interval.
And maybe it's not putting in a confidence interval, but the understanding of variability. People very much want those defined numbers. That's probably a bigger kind of general understanding of statistics, which might idealise.
I have to say, I'm going to watch Match Today on Saturday now with a whole new perception. Yeah. So we've got a couple of minutes left. I'll quickly cover the question about Arsenal. So I think that was the stats said the guy was fantastic, but the reality is he's not very good. Is that more or less what you said? Yeah.
I heard on the grapevine that although they bought Stat DNA, they didn't actually use it much under Wenger, and because he controlled the club. So I wonder how much of a say that had in it. Nowadays, I think it's much different with him gone and the structure changed, and the signings may reflect that. They may be using that more, but I think that was bought because they could, and whether they actually could feed that in at the time, I don't know. So it might be the data didn't really affect who they bought, and he just bought who he wanted. That's rumour and innuendo, though.
Okay, so I'm going to go down the line. So I thought the final question from Andy was actually a good one that we could end on. So we'll go down the line. Are we now doing statistics in service to sport or in service to gambling?
I don't know if I understand the question correctly. What I can say is I'm often in contact with these data providers, and so they buy this data from whoever owns it. They collect it. When they buy the rights, they collect it and then they resell it. Generally speaking, they've got three major revenue streams. And they've got gambling, which is one. They've got media, so the type of content and engagement, of which really I can't say much because I don't know. I have no contact with that world. And then the third one is performance of players and football teams. So generally, these are the three main streams for football, but actually other sports as well. Now I don't know which is the dominant one in terms of revenue, so I wouldn't be able to say anything about that. What I can see though is gambling is a fairly well established way of making revenues for them. They can come to us and say, here is the data, if you can make money out of it, I'll take, well, I'm going to cost you that much. Media, as we were discussing before, I don't think they know, the TV knows how to engage yet, but with the use of this data. And even worse, football teams know even less how to use all of this XG data when it comes down to performance and buying players. However, I think there will be some changes with tracking data, in particular all of the speed data, jumps, heart rate, so all of the data the football teams are currently recording for performance reasons. Now, some of it might become available for others to use. But I know that football teams use the data that they have and the data that they buy into trying to evaluate the performance of players. I just think they don't know very well how to do it, or they're not telling us, or it's happening, we just don't know much about it. Whereas gambling is always there as the obvious, well-known revenue stream, and then media being the other one. So I don't know if I answered your question, but hopefully after it gives some context.
Okay, well, same question.
Cool. I think that gambling is like a dirty word sometimes. People perceive it to be bad, but if we flipped it and said it was finance, and actually we were talking about, companies in the media, companies who provide, users who kind of websites who sell kind of financial services and hedge funds who use it, probably wouldn't be any kind of issue around it. It might be the same type of thing. The companies that are kind of more data-driven in gambling are more akin to hedge funds anyway. Like, that level of sophistication that's out there is similar. It's just a different application. I think in terms, I basically just agree with you. I think there's huge rooms to grow. That side of it, the sides that are really clever will always embrace it, whether it's, hedge funds, companies, bookmakers, gamblers, companies that provide financial services. They'll understand the value in it because they're at the cutting edge. The media and, say, the clubs, and, say, sports or teams or players, they'll be much slower to adopt because they're already doing their thing. If you look to America and you look at all those American franchise teams, they're well on top of their data and they'll have people in doing it. I think we'll kind of see that shift as data science and more available, easily usable techniques are kind of going to push us along that way, but the adoption is going to be slower than those who kind of know what's already there. They're first in. I think it will come, but it's just going to take time.
So how do you get the last word so we'll still wait on your rant?
Okay, yeah. I guess from my perspective, so from looking sort of in the literature and stuff, does seem to be a shift towards, well, it might seem like there's a shift towards sort of the gambling side of it, but I think that's just because prediction is as people go for prediction rather than sort of inference, or seem to a bit more. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the aim is to predict. So because I guess the assumption that people make is that if a model predicts well, it's clearly got a good grasp on the reality of what's going on, and therefore it's a decent model. So yeah, I guess it might seem like there's a shift towards gambling, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it is, from what I've seen anyway. It's just different techniques used to model validation.
Okay, well, time is now against. I have to confess, when Rob told me this was going to be an hour and 20 minutes, I thought, how are we going to fill an hour and 20 minutes talking about sport? But I believe we have, which has been brilliant. I think we could have carried on for another half an hour or so. So it's now time for lunch, but the guys will be around, so if you've got any particular points you want to make over lunch, please do. So really just to thank us, these three panel members.